Hi, I'm Tom. In this video, I'm going to be showing how I paint my Imperial Fists. I paint them the same way, whether it's 30k or 40k. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on 30k because that's what I'm painting mostly at this point in time. I did consider including some stuff for 40k, but I'll do a few showcases towards the end. And if it's super highly requested, then I guess I can make a follow-up video on how I would tackle specific 40k challenges. I'm not making this video because I'm the greatest painter in the world. I'm not gonna pretend that I am. I'm making this video because once I haven't painted stuff in a while, I sometimes don't remember the process. So like much of this channel, this is for future me. Also, a bunch of you have requested or asked about certain things, so here's a video that I can just refer to in the future. Let me stop waffling and get into the stuff that you're here to see. I start off with a prime of pure white. I suppose you could do a cenithal, but I'm doing a pure white base coat. This is the style that I like and it works for me. A note on the primer, I'm using, in this case, Army Painter's white. It's just because it's pure white. I have in the past used Corax white from Citadel, and it is slightly off-white. And since my paint scheme is based on washes and contrasts, the end result really does show. Here's an example. It's a bit hard to show on camera, but it's really apparent in real life. So, the yellow, it's probably the most important in an Imperial Fist army. I started this style of paint job back in probably 2011, 2012-ish, something like that. Up until that point, I believe I used Avalon Sunset. It looked alright, but it was unsustainable for me. Then a Games Workshop manager in Belfast introduced me to this concept of priming it white. And then at the time, contrast paints weren't a thing, but some of all these colored shades was a new thing. And this one, Cassandora Yellow, we experimented, and after a couple of layers, it turned out to be nice and vibrant. Now a note on that, I don't think the tone of it has changed over those many years, but the dilution of the paint certainly has. The first models I ever made using this technique, I believe I just did 2 layers. Now I'm up to maybe 5 layers in some cases, and it varies from pot to pot even. So the downside of this is that I have to have a reference model next to me to be sure that I hit the same saturation. So the process here is to paint yellow everywhere that needs to be yellow, let it dry, try to minimize some of the pooling. In my case, I'm not always too careful with the pooling and I hide it with battle damage, which is kind of a win-win, I suppose. Gives a little bit of surface variation, but if you're trying to do this clean, then you should pay attention to the pooling. But yeah, let the layer dry, apply it again, check your reference model, let it dry, so on and so forth until you hit the desired intensity and saturation. At some point you think you've gone too far and it starts to look very orange. I usually find that's the right spot, or you're actually a layer shy. As soon as the other colors gets applied to the model, the yellow will sort of start to fade away again. So I'm doing black trim and various armor panels and equipment. And for black, I'm using the contrast paint Black Templar. This also seems to be diluted a little bit over time, so now I'm up to 2 layers of that. This is the spot where your mistakes are most apparent because there's high contrast between the yellow and the black. I try to just use a finer brush, a little bit of patience, and if I do make a mistake, I take a brush, load it up with some water, flood the area, and try to either soak it up with a brush that's dry or a piece of paper towel. If I miss something, then I can either go back and fix it by painting white and then Cassandora yellow, or I can try to hide it with weathering and battle damage, as you will see later on. Pouches and holsters are pretty simple. I simply just use Wildwood contrast paint, just a single layer, and we're done. Some details I paint red, such as crack grenades. You might want to paint your frag grenades red. I just paint mine red because that's what I'm used to from video games and whatnot. I also might paint sergeant helmets in corn red, or I might paint it flesh tearers red. For my frag grenades, I'm using Wa Flesh. I also use this as a base if there are any laurels, and then in the case of any laurels, after having washed those with either Agrax or Nuln Oil, I highlight that with Nurgling Green, but I don't show that in this video. For pretty much all my metallics, I'm using Lead Belcher. I'm using this on exposed cabling, on the undersuit of the Marine, weapon parts, various bits on the armor, and all the rivets. Besides the yellow and the black step, this is the one that takes the longest. I'm not quite as careful as I am with the black, as any accidental silver just adds a bit of wear and tear in the way that I do it. If you're doing yours pristine, of course you need to be more careful than I am. Here we can see what I was talking about earlier. Once some of the base colors gets on there, it starts to look less orange. And using my reference model, it looks like I need another layer of Cassandora yellow. I believe in this instance, I did water it down a little bit while I applied it, as not to overshoot the mark. But that last layer is usually a subjective thing. When it comes to the eye lenses, I use Flesh Terror's red, as it's easier to get that to pull into the eye lens holes. Time for a little bit of washes. I'm using Nuln Oil for almost all of my shading needs. It goes on all the Lead Belcher parts, on the grenades, and if there are any rivets, I dab the rivets just to make a black outline around it. Sort of a panel lining technique, I suppose. If I'm going with the theme of GW and their paint quality over time, I sorely miss the old Nuln Oil. This one's just weird, but I don't want to change the recipe with that many years of painted models. If there are any really prominent lines in the armor, such as vent slits in the helmet, I usually give that a little bit of Nuln Oil as well to increase the contrast of the face. Speaking of contrast and panel lines, to soften up the transition from the black trim on the shoulders in this particular armor mark's case, I also do a thin layer of Nuln Oil along the rim of the black where it meets the yellow. It just sort of softens up the transition, and if anything, it just looks like a little bit of wear and tear in the edges of it. I'm applying some battle damage to my Marines, and I'm doing these ricochets off of the armor as my main source of battle damage. Over the years, I've been very conflicted if I should do it differently, if I should actually drill some holes to make the impacts, at least this way it's non-destructive. I'm doing this because I don't want my Marines looking fresh out the factory, and also as a sort of mechanism to deal with any annoying transitions or tide marks from the wash-based methods that I'm doing. So the way that I've done battle damage for all these years, and that might be about to change, I'll show you that towards the end on one of my 40k models. But the way I'm doing it here is that I'm taking a small brush and then some Mournfang Brown. This is to represent either rust or grime that's built up in the bullet impact area, or just the underpaint of the yellow paint on the armor. But what I'm doing here is making either some streaks or some little fragmentation splatters with the tip. I'm just trying to make some on different armor panels to break it all up. I think it does add a lot of character, but as I said, I'm often unsure if I should change the way that I do battle damage. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm showing how I've done it up until now. We'll be highlighting it in a little bit with some silver, and this is where it really starts to pop. You can go crazy and be super realistic with this, but across a whole army, this method works for me. Speaking of things I've been unsure of, here we are at the highlighting of the metal stage, and we're almost there. What I do on the battle damage part is that I just try to paint that pattern that I already painted, but just not go all the way to the edges. That way it looks like it's indented. You'll see it very quickly transform the model from kind of plain and gives it some pop. But yeah, speaking of things that I'm unsure of, I also go through almost all of the metal panels and give them a little dab of a bright silver. In this case, I'm using Stormhost silver, but I believe in the past I've also used Runefang silver, so this part is not too important. But as I said, I go over many of the panels and various rivets and whatnot and give them a little bit of a highlight. Under close scrutiny, this kind of looks a little bit too cartoony, and this is what I'm struggling with myself, but at a distance and on an army level, I think it really pops. So I'm trying to reconcile if, even after all these years, if I like the bold highlights that I'm doing on the metal or if it's too much. I think at this point, the ship has sailed and I just have to stick with it, but it's always healthy to evaluate your past choices, especially if you're going to start a new army at some point, and see if you want to carry those choices over. What I'm trying to say is, don't let things be default just because that's the way you've been doing things. You can keep doing things the same way, but it's always healthy to just think about it before you do it. I guess that's the lesson I'm trying to teach my future self and maybe you guys. At this point, we're almost done. Didn't really talk about the basing in this video. My bases are quite simple. I've just taken a piece of cork, sliced and torn it into a shape that resembles a rock, and glued it onto the base with some PVA glue. The steps for painting that is quite simple. Abaddon black, then dry brush of Mechanicus standard gray, and then a dry brush of a bone color. It's kind of a cartoony stone, but it reads well at a distance. I could do it more realistic with more colors, I suppose. We're really at the last step of the painting now, and that's the weathering. This is where I tie the model into the base, and I'll also get rid of any pristine armor look. As I'm trying to show here, I'm doing a gradient, strongest at the bottom and getting lighter all the way to around arms pauldron level. I'm doing a gradient of Mournfang brown, as brown is a earthy color and I like this, and there's no way I'm gonna change it at this point. So I'm taking a dry brush, and as you do with all dry brushing, really, you get rid of most of the paint. And I start from the bottom of the model, checking the intensity level. And here you see me swipe off some of the brown off of some of the raised details, and also feather out some blotches. Make sure to catch the butt plate. And then I'll do the bottom of the power pack, the underside of the arms usually, the underside of the weapon, and just the lower portion very gently of the pauldrons. Finally, it's time to wrap up the base, and here I'm using Agrellan Badlands texture paint, just neat out of the pot. I'm actually not gonna dry brush it or do anything to it. I've tried that in the earlier experiments when I was deciding on a new basing scheme, and I just liked it neat as it was the most consistent for me. Surprise, surprise. There's not really much to it. I'm just using a tool here to apply it all over the base. The basing is very simple, that's on purpose, and it's to make it as generic as possible so it looks at home and immersive in as many environments as possible. I figure most planets would have a desert or arid biome. If it did a lush forest, it would look weird on a barren moon, for instance. So yeah, they're deliberately neutral. At some point I might go back and add some tufts to my entire army. I did that for my 40k army. I'm not sure if I'm gonna do that for my heresy force, but the option is always there. You can always go back and add more. And the last step, I'm using the Mournfang Brown again to paint the base rim. Once again, this is an immersion thing. I feel like it's a neutral color that can blend into the terrain and thus make stuff more immersive. A black rim is fine. I feel like it adds a border between the miniature and the environment in most cases. It's a preference thing. And here we are. Quite simple tactical marine Mark IV armor. Here is an example of a Primaris Marine that I painted using the exact same method. In this case, it would be a 5th Company Marine because of 40k and Codex compliant conventions. You can see I've done the battle damage a little bit differently. Instead of painting the battle damage on, I've used a little bit of sponge to stipple on first the Mournfang brown, and then either with a brush or again with a sponge, go over it with the silver. One of the common things on my models that I also didn't tackle in this video are power weapons. I did a quick and simple tutorial on how I do that. I've linked it and it's in the cards if you're interested in that. A little note on this Primaris Marine, I didn't show it on the main subject of this painting tutorial because he didn't have any gold parts, but in case of gold parts as this guy's Aquila, what I've done here is a base of Balthasar gold, a wash of Agrax Earthshade, and then a selective highlight of Retributor armor to really make it shine and pop, just like the Stormhost silver does for the silvers. But that's mostly it. Of course, there are special cases, special units, special markings, all that sort of stuff. But this is how I paint a basic Marine. At this point, it's also ready for transfers. I haven't gotten around to doing this for my army yet, but I will soon be doing that. In any case, I hope you learned something from this video, or at least were inspired or entertained or confirmed in your choices of painting by seeing how I paint mine in a different style than yours. But I want to thank you for watching, and at some point I will also do a video on how I paint my World Eaters. Those are also quite simple and effective. That's what I try to do. Simple and effective techniques. If you have any questions about my paint scheme, the methods I'm using, or want additional information on specific cases, then I do have a Discord and you can just ask me stuff in there or in the comments, but it's up to you. Thank you for watching. Cheers.